Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Faith Unaltered. I'm your host, David Russell, and look, we have our co-host Tyler Fowler back. He is here for one night only this month, so if you have any questions and want to give him some love and send him some love, send it our way. I'm also joined with my buddy Dale Glover, my favorite Canadian, and got a special guest, Ben Watkins, on again. What's up, Ben?
Hey guys, thanks for having me on.
Man, thanks for being on. It's an honor to have you again, man. We're also here with Travis Worth. This is his 2 weeks of Worth.
Yeah.
So what's up, buddy? How are you doing, man?
Doing really well. I appreciate this opportunity to kind of come on and share my thoughts. While I'm not an apologist or anything, I have a love and passion for the philosophy of religion and looking into these deep, interesting questions. And that's one thing I really appreciate Ben for, is these deep conversations we have. And so, this idea of like theism and value and what it sort of entails, what it wouldn't entail, is a very interesting conversation. And he and I have been meaning to have a dialogue on the philosophy of religion anyway. So yeah, it's a perfect opportunity.
Hey, Travis, just so I know, are you contractually obligated at the start of every show to say, I have a passion for philosophy of religion? I've just noticed that you're kind of...
Well,
gets paid $284 every time he says it.
Well, I do.
I'm trying to be funny, but...
No, but there's actually a reason I do that. So I don't pretend to be like a credentials I don't have, because I actually study atmospheric science. So I'm not a credentialed philosopher. It's in my spare free time that I have a love and passion for that. And so that's why I usually say that.
You study the air, Travis.
Right on. So how's my fellow Virginian been doing?
I'm doing well. I've been working on a project for Real Theology where we're doing a series on David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. And so we're just going through and kind of doing a really deep dive into all 12 sections. And so I released section 9 recently with Dr. Joseph Campbell, who's a metaphysician. And so it was basically Hume's, how he interacts in the dialogues with the cosmological argument that would be offered by someone like Leibniz or Samuel Clarke. And so it was a really fun time. And so I've been having a lot of fun with this project. But it's kind of nice to shift gears now and go to moral philosophy to discuss that with Travis tonight.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Dale, how was your week, buddy?
Yeah, I'd say pretty good, actually. It was nice to get a rest. So this is my first and only podcast this week. And just talking to my brother and stuff. He's down, he's a trader. He's down in Tennessee right now visiting in the US. And he sent me a picture because he
won't be back.
He won't be. Well, judging from this picture here, he's not too impressed with the way you guys have your milk. Can you guys see that?
No.
It's not popping up. Maybe you got it. Someone's got to bring it up.
Man, that ain't even like milk. What is that? Look, just because they throw a picture of a cow on it don't mean nothing, okay?
Well, this is what you guys got down in Tennessee. It's nothing compared to our milk bags. So
we're gonna have to talk to Dane about that.
I've literally never had one of those in my life. I've never seen them.
That's not American,
right? So, Tyler, how was your 4th?
Bro, it was great. Like, we took Kelsey to go watch fireworks, and she was more interested in YouTube videos than the fireworks. And so, you know what? Next year, like, I'm saving the money. Okay, period. Nope, we're going to stay and watch YouTube. No, it was good, though. It was good. She got to ride some rides. I posted some pictures on Facebook for everybody to see. And so she had a blast doing that, though. But not a big firework girl.
Yeah, you getting the rest you need and spending time with the wife?
You're funny. I got a 12-week pregnant wife. No, I'm not getting any rest at all. Like, I got to do everything. She's the one getting the rest, not me. No. No, it's good. She is getting a lot of rest though. I'm getting more rest than I would have, any other given week. So we do get to sleep in a little bit more. But no, everything's going good on that end. She goes and gets her next doctor's checkup. Not an ultrasound this time. So the next one, it'll be an ultrasound. But yeah, everything's going good with that. She's got this Doppler, bro, and she listens to the heartbeat like every day. And so it's cool to hear and see just the fluctuations in her heartbeat, like getting stronger and things like that as time goes on. So it's like it's really neat to see that working, how it does. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I'm going to turn it over to you, Travis. I know you
Hold
guys
on. I got a question. Have these 2 weeks of Worth been worthwhile?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, Richard and I, the faith
Leans into the pun.
right. No, we had a great discussion last week, and I'm sure this will be equally great.
Good.
Right on. So I'm going to let you guys take it away. I know you guys have an order you want to go in. I know, Ben, you said you might be going first. Travis told me. Okay.
Yeah.
let's
So
go.
I'll go ahead and
Yeah.
kind of open things up and just kind of set the stage for what I think is going to be an interesting discussion. So I was invited to come on today to discuss theism and value, but so that's really broad. So I wanted to kind of narrow in that question a little more. And so I want to start with the question tonight: is God the best explanation of basic moral truths? And so to just kind of lay out some common ground, what I take objective morality to be is that there are basic truths about what is good and bad, or right and wrong, independent of the attitudes of observers towards the objects of evaluation. So, for example, it's wrong to torture children for fun, regardless of what anyone thinks about it. If society approved of child torture, it would still be wrong. If I approved of child torture, it would still be wrong. And if God approved of it, it would still be wrong. So I have two basic objections that I want to make towards the affirmative answer to the question: is God the best explanation of basic moral truths? The first is that theologically based metaethical theories are not objectivist theories. So physical facts like the masses of certain atoms are objective, but something like funniness is not. Facts about our reactions to a joke constitute its funniness. Moral realists think moral wrongness is more like the mass of certain atoms than like the funniness of a joke. Even if the attitudes of subjects towards child torture changed, its morality would not. Child torture could not be right instead of wrong. Physical facts are not constitutively dependent on any observer. If we concede moral facts depend on an observer, we concede they are not objective in the robust sense physical facts are. So my second objection to the affirmative answer to this question is facts about God cannot explain any basic moral truth. So I believe that basic moral truths are necessary, but that God only exists contingently. So God cannot explain basic moral truths. So in order to meet this objection, the theist is going to have to say something about how God is an explanation. So one of the questions we can ask is, how does God potentially explain something like moral goodness? And I want to say that it doesn't. But now, why doesn't it? There's several options that the theist could take here. So the theist could say that God is by definition infinitely good, and so is the paradigm of perfect goodness. But the reply here is that the statement that God is good would be trivial if it were true. To be a substantive claim, goodness must explain the normative status of God rather than God explaining the normative status of goodness. Other people have said that God is morally good by nature because he is loving, generous, faithful, and kind. Now, this looks like it might be a potential explanation, but it presupposes the goodness of love, generosity, faithfulness, and kindness. So it doesn't actually explain why these features are good. Those features are what explain why God is good. So another thing we can ask is, how does God potentially explain our duty to obey his commands? I want to say that it doesn't. Again, the theist has a couple replies here. The first is that we should obey God's commands because otherwise he will punish us. Now, this might be a prudential reason to obey God's commands, but are all basic moral explanations reducible to prudential reasons? I don't think so, for reasons having to do with the autonomy of ethics, but that'll take us far too far astray from the discussion tonight. Another move that is available to the theist here is to say we should obey God's commands because God commanded us to do so. Now, this seems circular on the face of it, but even conceding that it is a basic unexplained fact, then it is more plausible the most basic unexplained fact is child torture could not be morally right, rather than God could not command us to torture children. All parties to this discussion can concede that child torture could not be right, and love could not be morally bad. But not all parties can concede what God could be like, what he could do, or whether or not he could exist at all. So the theist here has more brute, unexplained facts than the moral realist who says that these facts are independent of God. So still, what we're left needing from the defender of a moral argument is some reason to think God must feature as part of a best explanation of basic moral truths. But what is an inference to the best explanation? Well, the philosopher C.S. Peirce claims we can understand an inference to the best explanation in a schema with three broad premises. The first being some surprising fact is observed. And the second premise being if some hypothesis were true, that fact would be a matter of course. Therefore, there is reason to suspect that this hypothesis is true. Now, I think this schema is more or less right. So what I have to say and what follows will take it for granted. To recap so far, my main contentions are that theologically based ethics are neither objectivist accounts of basic moral truths, nor do they satisfy the second lemma of this Peircean schema. So to kind of formalize my objections here, the first is the best explanation of basic moral truths is an objectivist account of them. Theologically based explanations of basic moral truths are not objectivist accounts. Therefore, theologically based explanations are not the best explanation of basic moral truths. If we were to change God's attitudes, then it is what he is like, or we change God's responses to certain acts, like disapproving of child torture or issuing commands not to torture children, then we change what the basic moral truths are. This is clearly a subjectivist account rather than a robustly objectivist one. Moving on to the Peircean schema, God is not the best explanation of basic moral truths unless basic moral truths are surprising given the hypothesis there is no God, and a matter of course given God exists. But basic moral truths are not surprising given the hypothesis there is no God, nor are they a matter of course given the hypothesis God exists. Therefore, God is not the best explanation of basic moral truths. The crucial premise in each argument is their second premise, and both can be motivated with the Euthyphro dilemma. So let me expand on that. In that dialogue, Plato has his mouthpiece Socrates contemplate the nature of piety with another character, Euthyphro. As Euthyphro strains under Socrates' notorious lines of questioning, he offers thoughts on the nature of piety. He says, the pious is what all the gods love, and the opposite, what all the gods hate, is the impious. Euthyphro is claiming that what all pious things have in common is they are loved by the gods. But Socrates is not convinced. He then poses one of the most important ethical questions ever asked. He asks, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Socrates will find both replies problematic for Euthyphro's claim, and concluding in the end that Euthyphro's notion of piety must be mistaken. If piety is whatever the gods love, and there is no reason that explains why the gods love these things rather than others, then what is pious is ultimately arbitrary, meaning based on random choice or personal whim. Were the gods to love racism and hate compassion, then something like segregation would be pious, and something like feeding the hungry would be impious. Any view of piety with this implication is not an acceptable view for that reason. So what of the other horn of Euthyphro's dilemma? Well, if the gods love something because it is pious, then Euthyphro's claim is simply false. Whether or not the gods love something is not what makes it pious or impious. Piety on this option is independent of the love of the gods. The lesson of the Euthyphro is that Euthyphro's notion of piety is either arbitrary or it's false because piety is an objective matter. I think we can similarly apply this lesson to contemporary moral arguments, and the most popular being William Lane Craig's. So I'll start with William Lane Craig's view. William Lane Craig makes a similar claim to Euthyphro's, though his view is more nuanced by modifying the traditional form of divine command theory. Craig's view of moral obligation still retains the traditional idea that God's commands determine what is right and wrong, but he also maintains that God's nature is identical to moral goodness. William Lane Craig claims, God's nature is the moral standard determining good and bad. He is the paradigm for goodness. It will be helpful to rephrase Craig's claim as the morally good is what resembles God's nature, and the opposite, what does not resemble God's nature, is morally evil. Notice how much this rephrasing resembles that of Euthyphro's claim about piety. What all morally good things have in common, according to Craig, is they resemble God's nature. But I think we should be as skeptical of Craig's view as Socrates was of Euthyphro's. We can ask, does the morally good resemble God's nature because it is morally good, or is it morally good because it resembles God's nature? Craig cannot concede the first horn of this dilemma because that would imply his view is false. So he must embrace the second horn, while also avoiding the worry of moral arbitrariness. Craig cleverly attempts to do this with his philosophical sleight of hand. He insists this is somehow a false dilemma, because God's nature is somehow identical with moral goodness, or the good. Putting aside the unintelligibility of a concrete causal nature like God's being identical to an abstract acausal property such as goodness, it is hard to see how Craig's reply avoids the worry of moral arbitrariness. If there is no moral reason why God's nature is loving rather than hateful, then such character traits are morally arbitrary. There is no moral difference if God is hateful rather than loving, in which case hating your neighbor might be morally good, and loving your neighbor might be morally evil. If moral goodness just is whatever God is like, then the claim that God is morally good is no longer a substantive moral claim. It merely states that God is whatever God is like. That's a trivially true but entirely devoid of any substantive moral content. In my view, Craig has not even begun to avoid the worry of arbitrariness. And worse still, he has reduced the theologically important claim that God is morally good to a trivial claim that gives us no information about what God is like, nor as to what we should live up to. The upshot of this is that irreligious skeptics like myself have no good reason to concede to William Lane Craig moral goodness is best explained by God's commands nor his nature. One, because it's not an objectivist account, and two, it doesn't actually explain anything. Now, I think Travis's view differs in very important ways from Dr. Craig's. So I want to now turn it over to Travis to let him articulate in what ways his view attempts to sidestep my two objections of we need an objectivist account and we need some account that has explanatory power. It makes the observation of basic moral truths a matter of course, whereas it would be surprising if we supposed God does not exist.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Ben. I really appreciate that. I mean, I think that's very valuable, and I think you bring up some really valuable concerns that the theist needs to take seriously. And so I'm just going to go through my notes here. This is basically going to be Josh Rasmussen's moral argument. It's basically off the moral argument he lays out in Is God the Best Explanation of Things? And so I'm just going to run through that. And so what I think would be valuable to start off is a definition of terms. I'm going to be referring to a perfect foundation. And so to lay out what I mean by perfection here, there are two ways to see perfection. Through the first lens, we see what perfection lacks. Perfection lacks defects. We can define a defect as anything that detracts from a thing's value. As an example, a car with a broken radiator has a defect that detracts from its total value. The second lens is what perfection has. Perfection has value. In general, more value means more qualities that are more positive. The highest value has the most positive properties. I call the highest value absolute perfection. A perfect thing is the greatest, most valuable kind of thing. A perfect thing has no defects of any kind. It is purely positive. In other words, perfection implies supreme value. By pure actuality, the foundation lacks limits. By reason, therefore, the foundation lacks limits in value. The foundation has some value. For example, it has the power to produce you and I. And so a supreme foundation would have value without limits. So in short, we can define perfect as something that lacks defects and has supreme value. The foundation has no defect, for a defect is a limit in some valuable positive respect, and the foundation has no limit in value. And the foundation has supreme value because anything less would mark a limit in its total value. In this sense, the foundation is purely positive, without any inner limit or imperfection, so it is perfect. From perfection with purely positive properties would also flow maximum cognitive power. So for short, I'm going to be referring to the foundation as a perfect fundamental mind. Now, given this backdrop, what I'd kind of like to lay out first is going to be in terms of our conscious experiences. What we experience by direct awareness. We have sensations, or something that it's like to sense right and wrong, better and worse, good and bad, what Josh Rasmussen calls insights into our moral window. We can call these sensations axiological. It seems a very important philosophical question to ask: why does the world contain beings like us with these axiological sensations? While it can be easy for us to take the feelings of good and bad for granted, because they're all too familiar to us, they're actually anything but trivial. We could easily imagine a world without any consciousness. We could easily imagine a world without any axiological sensations at all. For example, we could imagine a world where organisms can feel heat and cold, but could not feel good and bad. It is entirely possible that purely non-moral states could be the sole drivers of adaptation. But this is not the world that we find ourselves in. Interestingly, our world does contain the feelings of good and bad, right and wrong, virtue and vice. The feeling of good can be thought of as being part of an axiological landscape. As Ben and I are both moralists, we'll put the nature of the axiological landscape on the shelf, as this is a point of agreement between us that moral truths are independent of our own personal judgment. According to both Ben and I, to torture an infant for fun would be morally wrong, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it. What I want to mainly focus on here is going to be one of the less controversial dimensions of the axiological landscape, and that's going to mainly be the observation that we have sensations, moral sensations. The sensation that some things are truly good and praiseworthy, while other things are truly bad and have gone wrong. Why are there beings like us with these moral sensations? Completely random evolution doesn't seem like the complete explanation. From what I understand, computer-based simulations of evolution have never produced creatures with any sense of right and wrong, and have not even come close to it. I would say this is not at all surprising, because without a moral foundation and a design plan, there would be no reason to expect the existence of morally sensitive beings to emerge. We could expect non-moral states to indefinitely continue producing non-moral states. With a fundamental mind, however, we have a clear mechanism to explain the aspects and dimensions of an axiological landscape. A foundational mind would have intentions and causal powers to aim for valuable things, including morally sensitive beings in an axiological landscape. For the sake of simplicity, we can say that the simplest account of this mind's nature is that it's absolute perfection and lacks arbitrary limits, and thus contains the perfect rules for living and thinking. From this single root of value without limits would spring abstract moral principles and the intentional resources to produce beings capable of apprehending these principles. This would explain more than other metaethical theories with the least amount of additional theoretical content. As Josh Rasmussen states in How Reason Can Lead to God, this is a quote: "In science, one way to investigate competing hypotheses is to consider how well these hypotheses predict observations. For example, certain climate change models that more clearly predicts actual observations are more likely to be true. Typically, the more accurate the predictions, the more probable the hypothesis. We can apply this test here to our moral foundation hypothesis. In consideration of what a moral foundation predicts, it would predict certain things flow from its moral nature. In particular, a moral nature includes basic moral qualities like goodness, value, and the power to distinguish right and wrong. The moral foundation has the resources of a fundamental mind. As such, it has the power to aim for a certain sort of world. Like an artist can paint a picture, a moral mind could paint a morally textured universe with other moral beings in it. In fact, a morally textured universe is just the sort of thing we may expect a moral foundation to create. Without a moral foundation, by contrast, we face a prediction problem. Non-moral states don't predict a moral landscape with moral agents who can apprehend moral principles." And so a point of clarification here is that this is not a traditional moral argument for the conclusion that a moral standard requires a fundamental mind. This is specifically about the conditional expectations governed by the usual Bayesian formula. So we could let A be A equals, there exists an axiological landscape that includes agents with some minimum axiological sensations. Let M equals, there is a perfect fundamental mind. In such a case, the probability of A given M is greater than the probability of A given not M. Therefore, other things being equal, A supports M. And so with that, Tyler, do you want to bring the slide up that we had? Okay, so this is how Josh kind of ties everything together with perfection. So perfection unifies all the attributes of the foundation. Perfection is the deepest attribute from which all positive attributes flow. From this singular aspect arises the foundation's moral nature, to act perfectly, its mathematical nature, to reason perfectly, and its great power to fine-tune a world for people like you and me. Perfection accounts for the self-sufficiency of the foundation. A foundation that is not self-sufficient is not perfect, while a perfect foundation is self-sufficient. Every positive attribute flows from the foundation's perfect nature. Perfection also unifies the world. The world includes diverse dimensions like mental, material, moral, and mathematical. We can ask, why do these dimensions populate our world? Here is why. These diverse dimensions all flow from a single root. They all flow from pure perfection in the foundation. From pure perfection flows the perfect way of being, which is the foundation of all moral principles. From pure perfection flows perfect knowledge, which is the foundation of all principles of reason and mathematics. Moreover, a perfect mind has every reason to create a material world suitable for other minds. The perfection of the foundation then successfully predicts every dimension of the world. And so that's it. That'll be Josh's argument.
Right on, guys. Well, I'm going to first, Tyler, Dale, do you have any clarifying questions?
Clarifying. I definitely have questions and stuff, but
I just want, if there anything you need them to clear up before we, because I want them to dialogue and then we'll get questions later on.
Yeah, sure. So just one clarifying question, Travis.
Sure.
So me and you were talking about this before the show, but just for the sake of the audience, can you maybe just clarify exactly how your moral argument is different from someone like William Lane Craig's standard moral argument type deal?
Yeah, so I'm going to need to bring that up. That's going to be when I really so I have some notes that I'm going to go off that addresses Ben's argument. I can go ahead and get into that now, but if you want a short answer before
go ahead and lay that out. I think that'd be that's a really good way to just kind of segue into, because I put Dr. Craig's view out there so that you could distinguish yours from his. That seems like pretty much the perfect place to start, I think.
That's a great idea. Just give me 1 second to pull it up here.
That's why I'm the host.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to read the notes I have here. So one clarification, philosophers like, what Josh Rasmussen is wanting to make is that God's nature doesn't make values like goodness, compassion, justice, and so forth. Josh has even said that the Euthyphro dilemma persuaded him to think that it's a mistake to think that God's nature grounds morality, even the principles that comprise God's own nature. Some things are just intrinsically right or wrong, independently of what anyone thinks, says, or even is. So under Josh's account, God's nature doesn't make the principles of right and wrong. He would say that a perfect nature contains, but does not make the principles of value. That all value and all principles of value flow from the single simple feature of perfection. And perfection itself is valuable in a basic way. Perfection isn't valuable because it's part of God's nature. Perfection is part of the foundation's nature because the foundation is supreme. So there might be he believes that nothing at all would exist if God didn't exist, but he doesn't think that God actually controls and makes these moral principles what they are. So like the torture and infant for fun being morally wrong is just bedrock in its own right. So that's going to be a huge area where they distinguish. But now Josh will say that, he doesn't think that anything at all would exist if God didn't exist, but that's where he's going to differ significantly from Craig. And so that might be a good.
Fair to say that Craig's argument is closer to a moral argument that tries to infer the existence of God from the fact that there are basic moral truths. And your argument is more like an argument from design that says that, look, there's moral order in the world. And that moral order is is a matter of course given theism, but it's surprising given atheism.
Well, sort of. It is teleological, yes. That's very good to pick that up.
What do you mean by teleological? Yeah.
I'm sorry.
What do you mean by teleological? So teleological can be kind of tricky here, especially because you said earlier you used God as pure actuality. So when you say teleological, are you referring to it in like this Aristotelian sense? Are you saying
No, what I'm saying
in a
is that
neo-Aristotelian sense?
what I'm saying is, like I laid out, that God is absolute perfection, would have reason that his perfect goodness would give him motivation to, create a morally textured universe with moral agents that he would pursue that value. So he would have the intentionality to sort of bring that out, given his goodness. And then also one thing that's going to be significant about this argument that kind of differs from Craig is it's going to be a lot more heavily focused on the epistemic thing, the moral knowledge aspect, I think is going to be.
So Craig is arguing from moral ontology. He's saying that because of what there is in the world, that is a reason to think that God exists.
Right.
But
and
your argument, so hang on, just make sure that I have these contrast. So that's the first piece of the contrast here.
Right.
The second piece of it is that your argument is appealing to what we can know about the moral realm. And so it's our knowledge of certain facts within the moral domain, which is surprising given atheism, but is a matter of course given theism. Is that a fair way of comparing the two arguments as far as one is ontological, the other is epistemological? Is that a fair way to finish out that?
It is, because this is more about, it's more about the epistemic than the ontology. And, again, Josh is going to say that, these he uses the analogy of like moral truths being like pillars in a castle. That they're the castle, and the pillars are together. But God's nature, it doesn't actually make the values what they are. They're just, exist in a basic way. Whereas I think Craig's view, and it's what you have attention with, is this idea that, it's God's decision that makes moral principles obtain. And so that's where it becomes arbitrary and subjective.
Okay. I'm trying to make sure that we can understand the differences between the argument here.
Okay.
So, Dr. Craig is using a more anthropomorphic conception of God than someone like a classical theist would use. So this is the distinction between the theistic personalists and the classical theists who accept something like a doctrine of divine simplicity.
Right.
So Dr. Craig is going to want to say that, look, God, it makes certain decisions. And if he were to decide the moral truths depend on him deciding one way rather than another, or having some sort of nature rather than another. And the classical theist is going to want to avoid talk like this, theistic personalist talk. And so they're going to have this more mystical conception of God, in where that God's ways are not our ways, sort of thing. So, but this has two problems that arise immediately when we move away from Craig's anthropomorphic concept of God and move to this more mystical concept of a God beyond our ways. We have a question of, one, is this compatible, or is this coherent? Is this concept of God one that legitimately says something coherent? Now, there can be doubts about this, especially if someone adopts something like a doctrine of divine simplicity. But let's put that to the side for now. We'll come back to it if we need to. The other worry is, what is the empirical content of this mystical view of God? So if God's ways are not our ways, then how are we making judgments about God's divine psychology? Alvin Plantinga puts it this way. I think it's a really great way of putting it. He says, God is transcendent. His ways are not our ways. Right. His purposes are inscrutable. Can we really say how probable it is that God would create the vertebrate eye, or fine-tune the universe? Or in this case, create moral agents capable of knowing certain moral truths. Do we know enough about God to say what this probability is, even within very wide limits? And I think this is a really good question, because there's two kinds of probability that we could say here. We could take a statistical probability, what some at times called a physical probability. A statistical probability takes the number of times, like if we were to throw a dice or flip a coin a certain number of times, the dice is going to have a limiting frequency of 1 out of 6, and the coins are going to have a limiting frequency of 0.5. We're clearly not talking about a statistical frequency when we talk about the God probability of fine-tuning the universe or creating an axiological moral realm that beings can have knowledge of. What we're talking about is a propensity, the propensity of this God to create this way rather than some other way. And I think we're entirely in the dark about what such a being would or would not do. So those are the two worries that arise once we shift to Travis's more mystical concept of God. We have to ask ourselves, is this coherent? And we have to ask ourselves, what does this predict? Now, if we want to get into it, I think there are issues of coherency. But I think the more pressing issue, because we can quibble about coherencies, is how do we get empirical content from this hypothesis? How can we have any independent justification of what the propensity of God's will is to do anything? Seems like theological skepticism kind of looms here. And I think Plantinga articulates that theological skepticism really well.
Okay, so I have quite a bit to say here, Ben. I think you've misunderstood the argument. Tyler, can you bring that slide up again? This is not mystical at all. This Josh, it's very theistic personalist. In fact, he's often criticized for making God too personal, and it's actually panentheist. Okay, so what we have here, it's going to be a perfect fundamental mind. Okay, and so one of the things that this is going to go by is what Swinburne calls the Dionysian principle, that goodness is just diffusive of itself and thereby of being. So God, as perfect goodness, would have motivation to bring about and instantiate valuable states of affair in the moral, aesthetic, and alethic domains. We don't have to accurately predict exactly what he's going to do, but we can predict that he will be motivated to bring about valuable states of affairs. And when we see something valuable, we know that God would have reason to bring it about. And so, like he says here, perfection would unify the world. When we look at the diverse dimensions of mental, material, moral, and mathematical, and we ask why they populate our world, they all flow from a single root. They all flow from pure perfection. So we could epistemically tease out from absolute perfection the motivation for God to want to bring this about. That God has a perfect fundamental mind. So it's not this mystical view where we have no idea. No, it's God as perfect goodness wanting to bring about valuable states of affairs. So that's one area where I would push back, and I would say I think that's a misunderstanding of Josh's argument.
Okay, well, so that's one place where it's good that we could say, okay, this mystical model of God is not going to help us here,
right?
As far as making a design argument or a moral argument. So we have to have this anthropomorphic model. Awesome. So, but now a different worry is going to arise. So as we move away from that mystical model of God and we move back towards the anthropomorphic model of God, now we have a question of, is fundamental reality perfect in the way that you said?
No, and it doesn't need to be.
Okay, so when you put the slide up, you were saying that perfection was the thing that holds all of unity together. Yes. And you were also saying that perfection is what gives us the empirical content of the theistic hypothesis. Okay, so what I want to say here is that empirical content that comes with it is a double-edged sword. Okay. Because you're now going to get, you're going to have to get the problem of evil is going to arise. So the let me say something. I've now that I've put the problem of evil on the table, let me try to unpack that a little bit, just so that for the audience's sake, because the question now becomes the thing that is has the empirical content for the hypotheses is the supposition that the foundation is perfect. Now, I thought Travis just said, he doesn't need the supposition that the foundation is perfect. Well,
no, the world is perfect.
No, so that's not. No, we're talking about the empirical content of the hypothesis. What makes it probable that we would observe X rather than Y?
Yes, is the foundation
is because we are adding the supposition that the foundation is perfect.
Yes.
But now this is where the problem of evil is going to arise.
Right.
So the problem of evil presents all forms of theism with both an in-principle objection and a de facto one. So the in-principle objection is often called a logical argument from evil. And these arguments claim that the conjunction of certain justified beliefs logically entail there is no God. If there really is any supreme mind worthy of the title God, then we must allow that its power, wisdom, and goodness are infinite. I think Travis stressed that by saying it would have arbitrary limits otherwise.
Yes.
By infinite goodness, we suppose that particular quality of moral character to prevent or eliminate all suffering so far as can be properly done.
No.
But it should be noticed that those natural processes of predation, starvation, and disease integrated in the biological evolution of human and non-human animals involve a great deal of suffering that someone of infinite power and wisdom could properly prevent or otherwise eliminate entirely. Therefore, it follows there is no such being as God. God might not be a potential explanation of anything, because such a being could not exist in any possible world with properly preventable suffering, and our world contains such suffering. Following the Lisbon earthquake, Voltaire wittily remarked, God's only excuse is that he doesn't exist. And that's basically an in-principle logical argument from evil. But let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that either God's power, wisdom, or goodness are finite rather than infinite. They have some arbitrary limit. This might resolve that previous logical problem at a great theological cost. But does it avoid the de facto objection from evil? And I don't think it does. David Hume famously asked, is the world considered in general, and as it appears to us in this life, different from what a man or such a limited being would beforehand expect from a very powerful, wise, and benevolent deity? It must be strange prejudice to assert the contrary of evil. So Hume articulates an evidential argument from evil like this. 4 hypotheses can be formed concerning the first causes of the universe: that they are endowed with perfect goodness, that they have perfect malice, that they are opposite and have both goodness and malice, that they have neither goodness nor malice. Mixed phenomena can never prove the 2 former unmixed principles, and the uniformity and steadiness of general laws seem to oppose the third. The fourth, therefore, seems by far the most probable. That is, that the first causes of the universe are neutral with regard to good and bad. So if we were to look at the world and infer what is God like, those inferences can either entail that that the foundation is not perfect, or the most probable inference is that the foundation is neutral to good and bad, and so indifferent and not going to respond to our religious concerns. So that's the gap problem. Even if our background knowledge included a first cause and designer of the universe, we cannot infer the moral goodness, or what Travis wants to infer here, the moral perfection, because of our observations of facts about good and evil. We have no good reason to believe any prime mover or intelligent designer or foundation of the world cares about us in ways that would respond to our religious concerns, like caring about human affairs, responding to our prayers, defeating evil in the end, or promising salvation after death. However, laws of nature that are indifferent to good and evil are a matter of course, given naturalism. So in practice, good and evil confirm an indifferent universe, or atheism, and disconfirm a perfect foundation, or what we're calling theism here. So I think that the explanation, the moral explanation, is stuck between a rock and a hard place. If we have that more mystical concept of God, theological skepticism looms. But if we try to add empirical content by making a more anthropomorphic model, we run smack dab into the problem of evil, both its logical versions and its evidential versions, and that creates this gap problem.
Okay. Was that it?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was quite extensive, and I appreciate you bringing up the problem of evil. So just to clarify where we're at, the moral argument I presented was a bit misunderstood. That it's saying that there's a perfect foundation that predicts this, and so in light of that, we went apparently to the problem of evil, and we kind of, I guess, if I would have known you were going to the problem of evil, I would have had my slides for that ready. But that's okay. I can go most of it off the top of my head. So I hold.
So the original question. So you
brought up
it was perfect. You said that the foundation was perfect, but now the question is, why think that it's perfect?
And I'm gonna. And you tried to bring up the problem of evil as a defeater for that, and here's why I don't think that works. Okay, so it all comes down to our axiology, what sort of axiological view we hold, because we're looking at the foundation of axiology itself. And so my axiology is going to be following Joshua Sijuwadi, Trent Doherty, Marilyn McCord Adams, John Schneider of a defeat condition. I would say that God's only moral condition in authorizing suffering is to meet the defeat condition. And that's basically this idea where evil... wish I had my slides right. I could bring it up, but it's where evil will be integrated into a valuable composite whole and defeated, so that God is authorized in permitting any evil that isn't indefeasible. So as long as He can defeat that evil and make it, valuable and non-regrettable to the agents on whole, such that it becomes non-regrettable and they come to appreciate the valuable part that it played in their life, then it doesn't count against the favor of God. So we would go back to looking at the perfect foundation hypothesis, and God would be just in permitting these states of affairs to obtain if they are ultimately defeated with a higher value state than would be had the evil not occurred. So given the defeat condition, then that doesn't follow at all. We would have to see that these evils are in principle indefeasible. And unless that's demonstrated, the defeat condition doesn't, would be a defeater for that. So I'm good on the moral argument, and so far I'm good on the problem of evil, given that.
So what I'd want to say here is that, so we're trying to craft a best explanation of some observation.
Yes.
But now we've added content to your hypothesis with this defeat condition. So that defeat condition isn't something that we had agreed on in the beginning of the dialectic. We got clear on whether the
we didn't agree
model
on the
of God.
of evil.
Well, so we didn't agree on the model of God being used, so whether it was anthropomorphic or mystic, and so we moved to the mystic. But there wasn't this additional axiological assumptions about defeat conditions. So I think that this is one way in which there is a theoretical cost here of inelegance, so that the simplicity of the hypothesis decreases, therefore the prior probability decreases, because we've made the hypothesis more ad hoc in order to avoid refutation.
I don't think so. I think it can be argued that it's an entailment from absolute perfection. I think God's perfect goodness entails that He would naturally be inclined to defeat all evil and make it's in the pursuit of value, because the defeat condition entails valuable states obtained. That's the way He pursues value. Part of the way He pursues value is through defeat. So I don't see how that follows.
Well, but this is content that something like a naturalistic or atheistic hypothesis does not have to make. There's an asymmetry, but there's an asymmetry here in the sense that the atheist or naturalist can also have a concept of perfection, but doesn't need to add this extra appendage to the thesis, this defeat condition. But let's concede for the sake of argument that theism has this defeat condition built into it, and that this is a theoretical cost worth paying. We then have another question.
I don't grant that it's a theoretical cost.
I know. So that's what I'm conceding, is that that it comes out in the wash.
Okay.
But now we have this worry of whether there are certain evils that can even in principle be defeated. Okay. So someone who, you mentioned Marilyn McCord Adams, so she gives the example of horrendous sufferings.
Yes.
So it's not at all clear that God can defeat these evils in the end, in the sense of justifying allowing their permission. Now, you might want to say, well, God can compensate these people in an afterlife, an infinite afterlife, in a way that then defeats. But that assumes that that compensation justifies his not preventing the horrendous suffering in the first place. And I think that's just wildly impossible. Compensation is not justification. And God should not, so this goes back to that logical argument of evil, an in principle objection. No, horrendous suffering is suffering that an omnipotent God can properly prevent. Our deepest goods do not entail that we suffer horrendously. That's just not an essential feature of our deepest good. People can experience their deepest good without suffering horrendously. So I don't think that this defeat condition, this theodicy being added to the theistic hypothesis, actually works, because I think there are certain evils that just cannot be defeated because they are intrinsically so horrendous.
Okay, so and I appreciate you bringing up compensation. That's a very important clarification that's needed in terms of defeat. It's not, because I want to agree with you that the example that's often used is, like, let's say people come in and destroy your house, kick you out in the yard, then give you $1 million. Well, you're compensated, but them destroying your house is still wrong, right? So this is that compensation in that sense is wrong, but that's not what defeat is. So going back to Marilyn McCord Adams, the example she uses just as a possible scenario for a defeat of horrendous suffering is, she would say that Christ also experienced horrendous suffering. So these agents will have an intimate connection to Christ, and they will see that their lives were on the whole valuable, and they will share in his sufferings and have that intimate bond with him that will be so valuable to them that it will become non-regrettable. And while they wouldn't want it to happen again, they wouldn't wish it away either, because it's part of what made them who they are in eternity, valuable to Christ. And that's just an example of a way it could, in principle, be defeated. I've never heard of any indefeasible evil yet. It could be.
So I think suffering horrendously is that sort of. So I think that people who are tortured and have dismembered by people who they trusted. I don't think anyone can ever look back on that and say that their life was for the better because of it. And the fact that someone else died on a cross to me is morally irrelevant in the sense of justification for again, we're talking about an evil that an omnipotent God could have properly eliminated, in the sense that there is no there in which could have come out of this, in the sense that there is our deepest good just don't entail this. Like, we can conceive of our deepest good, and that's just not an entailment of it. Horrendous suffering.
Part of
can I interject real quick?
Real quick, though, I want to clarify this. There's a difference in axiology here, because this axiology would say that what's most important to God is to create a saint-fostering world. It's a world in which the highest virtues can be manifested, and that God is more
deepest good.
Where the highest virtues can, like love, compassion, and so forth, where the highest virtues can be manifested. The Strent Doherty's thesis.
Deepest goods. Yes, we're on the exact same page here.
Okay, okay. So where God can create, the deepest goods and everything, like you were saying, and what is most important to God is who we become in eternity. That's more valuable than what we necessarily go through right now, because when we're looking at the notion of defeat, we're looking at the agent's lifetime on the whole. We're not looking at some temporary time T. We're looking at the agents on whole, and with the notion of defeat, it will become non-regrettable to the agents, self-endorsing to the agents. That's what Marilyn McCord Adams, Joshua Seagewating, and all of them have wrote in regards to horrendous suffering is that it becomes self-endorsing by the agents, while they wouldn't wish it again.
And I'm challenging the plausibility of that.
And it becomes and I haven't
are there really forms of?
I haven't seen any justification for that though.
But I just gave a justification in the sense that I said that there is this set of deepest goods. Like we can have a set of deep goods that are realizable. An entailment of those deepest goods does not include horrendous suffering. People can realize all of those deepest goods without suffering horrendously. So what that entails is that it is not logically necessary that we suffer horrendously to achieve those deepest goods. Meaning there's something that God could have properly prevented. So if he had the power, he has the power by our assumption. If there's no arbitrary limits, God is infinite power. So he can properly eliminate all horrendous suffering, and everyone can still realize their deepest goods. Those entailments right there entirely undercut the idea that no, horrendous suffering is logically necessary for people to achieve these greater soul, the souls that they have to achieve that would be their deepest good. You have to maintain that horrendous suffering is logically necessary for that. And that's just not plausible.
No, we don't maintain that it's logically necessary. But what we do maintain is that it will become self-endorsing by the agents. So in kind of contradiction to what you're saying. So Trent Doherty lists like the fine tuning of a virtue producing world. And so there's a world that, has this much suffering, more intense and everything. And he says that we find ourselves in the right type of world that has the right frequency and intensity to foster sainthood. That God, it's not just about our suffering. It's about we're in the finely tuned amount to produce saints. That's Trent Doherty's saint fostering thesis. So again, I'm not seeing a problem here. I can conceive of
because you're making a prediction. Your prediction is that
I can see them becoming
their horrendous suffering in the end.
Well, maybe it's more valuable to them to become. Well, hold on though. Maybe it's more valuable for them to become saints and to defeat that suffering. And they look back on it and say, well, actually, this is more valuable. I'm glad I went through this. It made me a better saint. So I'm not entirely convinced that your thesis is an entailment.
Well, no. So I think what you need as an entailment of your thesis is that all of these people who suffer horrendously, in the end, will look back and endorse their horrific suffering. So people, again, who are raped and tortured and dismembered will look back on that and endorse it. And I think that's just a wildly implausible claim. And I mean, you want to say that this doesn't have any theoretical cost, but it absolutely has theoretical cost. I mean, this is a view that, like, certainly the secular moral realist is not going to have anything like this.
I'm not hearing anything other than personal disagreement. For example, with your scenario, I could just say, well, no, actually, a better, more plausible scenario, instead of God just giving them the virtues without the suffering, is they look back and are thankful for the suffering because it made them a saint, and it truly. But
you're saying that, but you're not offering any independent justification. So you're saying, well, I just don't see any problem with it. It's not a matter of whether or not you see any problem with it. It's if there's.
No, I'm showing an example of how that. I'm showing an example of how that could, in principle, be defeated.
There is no, so in principle, but can it be defeated in practice? So you might be able to say, maybe this is the case in principle.
That's all we have to say. That's Trent Doherty's thesis. All we have to say is it can.
But I don't think.
All right, guys, let each other finish.
No, Trent Doherty has said that all we have to do is show that it is in principle defeasible. That's all we need for the defeat condition to go through.
Well, then I just simply disagree with him, but he just doesn't understand the nature of evidential arguments from evil. Because
I don't think we're going to get anywhere going.
Yeah, because if you can say that it's possible that God can defeat all these evils in the end, but that doesn't at all entail that it's probable that God defeats all these evils in the end. Again, that's a probability that requires content. You have to justify that, and it's not going to do it with the content just built into theism.
I think it is, because he will show from God's perfection that the best kind of world for God to create is a world that fosters saints. And a world that fosters saints has,
But we can foster saints without horrendous suffering.
Right, but it doesn't have, in what Trent says, is that it doesn't have the value that it does had the evil not occurred. That's the definition of defeat, is that it.
But you're saying that the world is more valuable by adding more horrendous stuff to it.
No, what I'm saying is that that's not what it's saying, Ben.
But it is, because you're saying it. So I'm saying the world would be better without the horrendous suffering. You're saying that the world would be better because there would be saints that come out of people suffering horrendously. Yeah. I don't think the ends there justify the means.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My conversations usually go better than this. I don't know what went wrong.
Yeah, it's going good. I mean, you guys just disagree on a point, this happens.
Well, but he's right.
If I would have known we were going to be doing the problem of evil, I would have brought on my slides for the problem of evil. That's kind of a sneaky move, but.
Well, Travis, let's switch it up a bit at this point then, kind of thing. Like, you heard Ben's opening case. Is there something about his case that you want to discuss with him then, or just to change gears a bit?
I somewhat agree with the idea that moral truths are just bedrock in their own right. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I don't know, because I'm not in favor of Craig's argument, but I'm also not convinced that Ben's argument successfully critiques Craig's argument too. That's why I was asking if somebody else knew. I would just kind of let their arguments. But I think it has been made pretty clear that there's no problem with the moral argument of a perfect fundamental mind would have axiological reasons to create a moral world with moral agents who have moral sensations, and that's more probable given theism than naturalism. That's uncontroversial. And when it comes to suffering, the defeat condition would say that any suffering that is allowed, God can permit it if it's overall defeated for the agents on whole. And of course, the afterlife is an entailment of theism, and so that's. And I think that's where I'm at, and I think that's evidentially strong.
I have a probing question for both of you guys then. So this was one of the questions I wrote down, because obviously I do go more for a William Lane Craig notion myself. And one of my things in terms of moral values or principles, right? I kind of take a notion when it comes to aesthetic values. For example, I take a view called dispositional realism, which means it's kind of an in-between view of subjectivism and objectivism in the way that it's independent from will and arbitrary will and stuff like that. So it's almost the same with moral values as well, right? So values do have to be, it doesn't make sense to me that values can just exist objectively as an abstract, okay, someone's got to go soon. So just very quickly then, since Travis has got to go, how does it make sense? It seems to me that values are inherently an experience, a qualia of significance, and that requires a subject. How does it make sense to say that morals are truly objective, independent of a person or the aspects of a person? So, over to both of you guys.
Yeah, I think they're basically just necessary truths, and I think so we're looking at, there's an axiological foundation to reality. That's what I'm saying. This pure perfection, and from pure perfection flows the perfect way of being, which is sort of the foundation of all moral principles. And so as such, it would have axiological motivation to create other moral agents who can apprehend these moral principles in a moral arena. And so that's what we experience via direct awareness. And so I think it just naturally flows from the perfection of the foundation.
Yeah, so I think that basic moral truths having to do with value and obligation are necessary truths as well, but they're more analogous to truths like in mathematics or logic or the modal domain about what is necessary and what is possible. And so I think that they actually don't have anything to do with subjects at all. So the robust objectivist wants to say that, look, you could have no subjects at all, and it would still be the case that pain was worse than pleasure, just in the same way that 2 + 2 = 4, or that 7 is a prime number, or that I could have had breakfast, or I could have skipped it, or a truth like we should accept the conclusions of valid arguments with true premises. So these are just primitive truths in a domain of inquiry, this domain of inquiry being the normative. And so I think you can have non-moral normativity, and I think you can have moral normativity. And so I think my view, the robust realist, helps us understand both epistemic normativity and moral normativity, whereas I think the theologically based one doesn't do such a great job explaining epistemic normativity. It might have some plausibility when applied to the moral domain, because we associate things like moral obligations with certain commands. That's just one way we can conceive of normativity. But I don't think that that view extends very well to the epistemic domain of normativity, of what we should believe, based on like evidence. Do we have to believe evidence because God issues some command, or because God's nature is the paradigm of evidence? It doesn't really extend very well. So the scope of my view includes both non-moral normativity and moral normativity. So my view has more explanatory scope than any theologically based system of ethics that tries to explain basic moral truths.
Awesome. Thanks to both of you guys for that. So yeah, Tyler, David, do you guys have any, like Travis, I don't know, when do you have to take off?
It's pretty soon. I got that home repair that I need to get everything going. And
we had agreed to do like 5-minute closing, like wrap ups. Do we?
Yeah. You go ahead since you went first.
Yeah, guys, go ahead.
Yeah. So I want to just
questions, but I know Travis has got to go. So
we can stay and chat questions afterwards if you want. So let me try to clear up, because I think it was said that bringing up the problem of evil is kind of a sneaky move, but I don't think it's a sneaky move. I think it's a very relevant move based on the implications of how we've conceived of our model of God. So if you remember, I thought that there was a mystical model of God on the table, or an anthropomorphic one. And so we said it's not the mystical model. It had its own set of issues, but we can avoid those issues by moving to the anthropomorphic model. And so what I want to say is that, okay, if we're going to use an anthropomorphic model of God, if that's the feature that's going to be as part of our best explanation, if we're going to make an inference to the best explanation, now it matters what the prior probability and the posterior probability of theism is. And so we can't just piously attribute perfection to God. We have to justify independently that this this foundation is in fact perfect. It has goodness to its infinite degree. That's where the problem of evil, and by extension the problem of divine hiddenness, are going to come in. These are going to be reasons to think that, okay, even if we concede that there is some foundation of the world, we don't actually have any reason to think that it is partial to us, that it would respond to our religious concerns because of our observations about good and evil, or non-resistant non-theists. And these present both logical problems and evidential ones, in principle objections, de facto ones. And so this is a problem for inferring God as the best explanation of some fact. If we're another thing we cleared up, it's not so much a traditional moral argument like William Lloyd Craig. It's more like an argument from design, where we are trying to infer God from a moral order, from the fact that we see beings like us ordered in a way that they can apprehend moral truths. And so if we want to say that it's probable that God would create such beings, we need the supposition that God is good. That is the supposition that is undercut by the problem of evil. So I'm not just pulling it out of nowhere. I think it's a very important, if we're going to infer and make an inference to the best explanation, if we want to say that this is a matter of course, given theism, that's not so clear that it's just a matter of course, because there's a problem of evil.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start. when we had the phone call, it would have been nice to know, though, that I should have got my notes for the problem of evil, because I have a ton of notes on defeat. And then when you got it, so I'm like scrambling to remember my notes, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'll just try and go off the top of my head, and I'm like, yeah. So that did catch me off guard. I would have rather been prepared. So maybe another discussion when I have my notes together, and maybe we'll do another discussion on evil sometime. But okay, so anyway, to kind of go back to what my thesis is we're positive. It's simple, so it's only one kind. It has both simplicities, the number of things posited and the properties of things posited. It's just absolute perfection, and from perfection would flow perfect goodness and all these different attributes. That's what Josh's thesis is teasing out these attributes from absolute perfection would flow value without limits by definition, perfect goodness, and so forth. And that God, as perfect goodness, would have reason to create a moral world with other moral agents in it who can relate to him and make morally relevant decisions. That is more probable, given a perfect fundamental mind, than a mindless universe, a non-moral universe. And I find that uncontroversial at all. And when it comes to evil, so I think that Trent's thesis is built into, like Josh's argument from perfection, that perfect God, the best kind of world that God can create is a world that fosters saints. And I think God holds a defeat condition with his creation. And so there's what Trent calls the fine-tuning of a virtue-producing world. You can see the video I did on axiology that really covers this. That God creates a world that fosters saints. And there are certain logical entailments with that includes suffering. But Trent makes the argument that the amount, frequency, and distribution of suffering that we find in the world is not so overwhelming so as to, overwhelm the majority of the agents. But there's a reasonable chance of success for the majority of agents to become saints and develop these virtues. And he also, would say that, given theism, the afterlife is an entailment of that hypothesis. And so the agents go on building into the afterlife, building these virtues. That the highest good for God is to create a world that fosters saints. And it begins here. And, it does entail these certain bad states of affairs obtained, but that's accountable. I can account for these. And even the hiddenness and things of that sort, it can be accounted for on defeat, because on the defeat condition, in order for some X to be disconformatory, it would have to obtain on the whole. Now, being tried to claim that some agent, that it's just not worth it. That they can have these values without having to do the suffering. But I challenge that, because I can conceive of them when they become saints, they will realize, no, the value of becoming a saint and earning this and like going through what I did in it, making me a better person, the triumph over tragedy will make, it will have such a value to it that it will make them better off for it. And it will be non-regrettable. And as Trent says, that it's only conceivable, as far as that goes. So there is a bit of disagreement there, but I think that just about sums up the conversation.
Right on, gentlemen. That was good. It was a good discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Dale, anything you want to say there?
Yeah, no, I just want to thank both of the guests. Obviously, Ben, I like him as an atheist, and Travis, he's my brother from another mother. He's in philosophy of religion as well, and we're both Christians.
Yeah.
We have differences. I disagree with Travis quite a lot on certain philosophical issues, and that's fine. That's what it's all about. So yeah, thank you both for being on here and doing the show.
Tyler's, anything you want to add?
I ain't got much to add. Interesting debate or discussion. I think it would be cool.
Yeah, this is more debate style. Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. It's like an hour-long cross exam. So I appreciate that with 5-minute opening statements from each of you. So I appreciate that. But I think it would be interesting just listening to him go back and forth a little bit to either get Josh Rasmussen, right? Yeah. Josh or Trent Dordery to come on the show and maybe explain the Saint fostering method a little bit better. I think that'd be cool.
Yeah, that show I did last time covered Trent Doherty's Saint fostering thesis.
Right.
Yeah, he's a very well accomplished and respected philosopher, so he's not just putting out gibberish. He knows what he's talking about.
Sure. So Trent, if you're watching this, man, hit me up, faithandaltered@gmail.com.
He's a well respected philosopher.
let's talk about getting you on the show. But other than that, I thought it was a good discussion.
Ben
Y'all, I'll
again.
have to go back and watch it, so I can follow along. Philosophy of religion. Philosophy in general is not my area of expertise, and I'm not even going to pretend like it is. So I'll have to go back check it out a little bit. But good job, Ben. Good job, Travis. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So guys, just a real quick, Ben, if you want to just plug yourself real quick, plug your website and everything for us.
Yeah, so I'm the host, one of the hosts of Real Theology, a philosophy of religion podcast. My co-host Justin Schieber and I explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theist perspectives, and we try to see what all we can contribute to discussions in the philosophy of religion by offering defenses both of naturalism and alternative models of God.
Awesome. And Travis, you want to plug anything?
Yeah, I don't have my book on me. Oh yeah, I do. Right here. So you can see this, The Inner Witness of the Holy Spirit. It's available on Amazon. So what I did and what I'm really starting to get into is, I have a love for Christian philosophy. And instead of doing like apologetics and things like that, what I want to do is sort of translate Christian philosophy into devotionals. So I wrote this, there's some concepts like axiology, the argument from religious experience, and certain philosophical concepts that I wanted to sort of translate into devotionals. And so that's what I did here. And I'm actually going to be working on another one later this year. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, guys, again, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. We appreciate the discussion. And Dale has something to say. He's got his fingers going there. So
no, because while I have both Travis and Ben here, especially Ben, because he's doing a lot of work on miracles, on the 28th, I'm doing a debate with an atheist, Jordan from Reason to Doubt, who's another guy.
I know him.
He's another great atheist and stuff. So we're going to be debating how do we identify miracles, and I'm going to be kind of submitting my unique thesis. So if it's stupid, it's my fault. But I think that we can look at miracles, forget the supernatural, natural stuff. That's irrelevant. We can identify this as an intelligently designed event. Are there the fulfillment of specified complexity in these events? And that's how we identify miracles. So
can I ask you something? Can I ask you something, Dale? With that, and Ben may know too, because I know you've worked on miracles. Like me, so as an Eastern Orthodox, I'm a panentheist because I hold the essence and energies. I think God is, outside, but He's also everywhere within creation. There's no separation between God and the world. So I'm wondering if that would have any impact on like the way we understand miracles. If there's because it's not just that God is transcendent, but He's everywhere within creation. So I wonder if that would have any explanatory difference when we look at like laws of nature, miracles, or would it be the same scenario?
It could. I think it would.
Given panentheism,
I think regardless, because my mechanism, it doesn't speak about what is the mechanism? Is it some kind of supernatural thing, or is it some?
Well, yeah, usually it's about laws of nature and how God interacts.
Yeah, for me, it's more about kind of can we identify God's intelligent design in this event's occurrence or not? So it can kind of be independent of mechanism questions. So,
gotcha.
Yeah, if you guys both check that out, I love it. So I'll shut up and over to you, Dave.
Well, guys, again, thank you for coming on. Next week, guys, we've got an open mic night. We're bringing it back. We had such a great time doing it over the years that we said, hey, we haven't done it in a long time. Let's bring it back. So join us for that. Tyler, take us home one more time this month.
Good night. God bless. Stay like Christ.